I call this whole grains and half-truths because we've been given many half-truths about grains, the role of grains in our diet. It might be a bit of a stretch to call them outright lies, but you've heard this saying before, haven't you? The more you repeat a lie, the more likely people will believe it. Well, the same thing applies to these half-truths that surround grains. And they are half-truths. That is, there's a bit of truth in many of the claims made about grains, but there's a lot of things you're not being told or being overlooked. Whole grains are better for you than white processed flour products. Why'd they say that? Well, there are a number of epidemiological studies that show people who consume more whole grains compared to people who consume white flour products have less type 2 diabetes, less obesity, less heart disease, and less colon cancer. That's true. There's no question about that. So if we replace something bad, white processed flour, with something I would argue is less bad, less harmful, whole grains, there is an apparent benefit. There's no question about that. But let's look closer at that argument. Does this mean there's no diabetes? No, it means if you eat white processed flour, you have a high likelihood of type 2 diabetes. If you eat whole grains, you still have high likelihood of type 2 diabetes, just a little less severe than white flour consuming people. And likewise, weight, heart disease, and colon cancer. It's not that whole grains prevent those conditions, they're just less flagrant causes or contributors to those conditions. For instance, in the Nurses' Health Study, a very large epidemiological study, over about a decade, women who consumed white flour products gained 12 pounds. Women who consumed whole grains gained 11 pounds. Conclusion of that study, whole grains help weight management. You can see the silly, nonsensical kind of logic used in a lot of these studies. So the real study would be comparing grain consumption, let's say whole grain consumption, to no grain consumption. Have those studies been done? Yes, there's lots of data, evidence telling us that when you eliminate grains, you see spectacular improvements. That's where you see such things as not less type 2 diabetes or slightly less weight gain. You see weight loss. You see reversal of type 2 diabetes in the majority. You see a reduction in the factors that lead to heart disease. You see almost no colon cancer. So those studies, those observations have been made. Another common half-truth often repeated about grains. You must eat grains, particularly whole grains, for nutrition, for nutrients, such as B vitamins. Is that true? Well, it would be true if you replaced grains with soft drinks and candy bars. But it's not true if you replace grains with real whole foods, like avocados and pork chops and eggs and butter. When you replace grains with those kinds of real foods, there is no nutritional deficiency that develops. Not in B vitamins, not in folate, not in thiamine, not in riboflavin, not in pantothenic acid, not in vitamin C. There is no deficiency that arises in people who banish all wheat and grains from their diet. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because 99.7% of human time on this planet was spent not consuming grains. So Homo sapiens is actually quite well adapted to consuming a diet that has no grains. We only added grains in a moment of time ago, speaking anthropologically. So we are well adapted to not consuming grains. And when you do consume wheat and related grains, there's something in them called phytates. And phytates are very good at binding minerals in your intestinal tract. So if you eat, let's say, a sandwich with 2 slices of whole wheat bread, the phytate content of that sandwich is more than enough to bind nearly all the iron, zinc, calcium, and magnesium. And you poop it out in the toilet. So any minerals you took in with that meal are lost. And that's why, for instance, iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia are very common in grain-consuming people and can be quite severe. So we're told we need grains for their nutrition and for the nutrient content. The opposite is actually true. When you banish all wheat and grains from your diet, the levels of many minerals go up. Likewise, other nutrients like B12. B12 deficiency is commonly caused by grain consumption. By a number of routes, but one route is that the gliadin protein of wheat provokes what's called autoimmune gastritis, where the inner lining of the stomach becomes inflamed by an autoimmune process and destroys cells called the parietal cells that produce the factor necessary for B12 absorption Also, it blocks hydrochloric acid, stomach acid production, and leads to other nutritional deficiencies. In other words, we were told grains are necessary for nutrition. No, the opposite is true. Grains destroy nutrients or block their absorption. And when you return to a diet that humans have followed for the first 99.7% of our time on this planet, that is devoid of all grains, nutrition improves. Yet another half-truth often repeated is that you must eat grains, particularly whole grains, for their fiber content. Well, there's a grain of truth, sorry about the pun, there's a grain of truth in that argument, in that when you banish all grains, you do lose a couple or 3 or 4 grams of prebiotic fibers, that is, fibers that nourish bowel flora. So the average American gets about 6, 7, or 8 grams of prebiotic fibers per day if they include grains in their diet. When you banish all wheat and grains, your intake of prebiotic fibers drops to about 4 grams per day, and that's not good. The ideal intake of prebiotic fibers for a human is 20 grams per day. That's where you get all kinds of wonderful effects like metabolic improvements, a reduction in insulin resistance, a reduction in blood sugar, reduction in blood pressure, reduction in triglycerides, better mental and emotional health, etc. So that occurs at 20 grams of prebiotic fibers taken in per day. So when you do banish wheat and grains, you do lose a little bit of prebiotic fibers. So what we do is we aim to achieve the ideal intake of 20 grams per day. Not with grains, of course. We do that with legumes, root vegetables, small servings of root vegetables, powders like inulin that are very convenient and portable, and unusual sources like a raw white potato chopped coarsely into a smoothie. You'll find these recipes, by the way, called detox shakes in my Wheat Belly 10-Day Grain Detox, also in my Wheat Belly Total Health book and the Undoctored book. Because what we're doing is trying to mimic the behavior of primitive people. Primitive people don't make these shakes, of course. They go out in the forest or jungle and dig in the dirt for underground tubers and roots. Well, you don't want to do that, right? You maybe live in a northern climate where the ground can be frozen. It's inconvenient, right? So we mimic that behavior by drawing from other prebiotic fiber sources of the sort that are available to modern people. Now, when you banish wheat and grains, most of the fiber that you lose is not prebiotic fibers because there's not that much in grains to begin with. Most of the fiber you lose is cellulose fiber or bran, which is inert. Humans can't digest it. It just goes in and passes right through into the toilet. And that provides bulk. But the need for bulk is a fiction. The evidence showing us that we need fibers was evidence showing us that it's the fibers from vegetables and roots that we need, not from grains, not the inert cellulose fiber from grains. Nobody here has a sawdust deficiency, right? Cellulose deficiency. So what you really need is to amp up your prebiotic fiber, and that's how you regain not only metabolic health, but better bowel health. People who eat no grains and get plenty of prebiotic fibers, populations like that have no colon cancer, no diverticular disease, no hemorrhoids, no constipation, no acid reflux, no reflux esophagitis, no stomach or duodenal ulcers, no pancreatic cancer. Do you get the idea? We've been told to follow a diet rich in healthy whole grains that causes gastrointestinal disease. And it's often blamed on a lack of fiber. You see the flawed logic? No, it's a lack of prebiotic fibers, and because we rely on this corrupt thing called grains that provides cellulose fiber that you do not need. Another common half-truth. You can't do well in life and health if you eliminate an entire food group. Well, we talked about how humans did not consume wheat and grains for the first 99.7% of our time on this planet. So I would argue that wheat and grains that are really seeds of grasses, that's what grains are, they're seeds of grass plants, are not required, are not necessary for humans to survive. In fact, humans thrived for 3.5 million years by consuming no seeds of grasses. So if you and your family or clan were starving and you stumbled on a field of grass, grains, would you say, hallelujah, we're going to eat like kings tonight? No. Grasses are not instinctively seen as food by humans. We had to go through some very serious manipulations in order to try to convert the seeds of grasses into food, not knowing that this thing that did have some calories in the form of amylopectin A carbohydrate also extracted a health price when consumed over time. And that health price can show up as weight gain, type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, migraine headaches, acid reflux, colon cancer, diverticular disease, and on and on and on. So there is nothing lost in eliminating this presumed food group because it's not a food group. It's not supposed to be consumed by humans. Yet there's an entire industry that's based its success on propagating this notion that grains are a food. I know this is kind of shocking to some people, but recognize that once you understand these principles and start to think more clearly about nutrition and what should be called food, you have been given a license to thrive, be slender, be freed of literally hundreds of health conditions. If this kind of conversation interests you, I invite you to explore it more. My Wheat Belly books, my Undoctored book, my Wheat Belly blog, a very busy place, the Undoctored blog. Of course, subscribe to this YouTube station, or if you really want a real serious treatment of these kinds of issues, join my membership website, the Undoctored Inner Circle.